This is the story of Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky. And a queen sat at her window working, with her embroidery frame made of ebony. And as she worked, gazing at times out at the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood on the snow. And when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself,
"Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the ebony frame."
Not very long after this, she had a daughter, with a skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. She named her Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. A year later, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but very proud and overbearing, and she could not be surpassed by beauty by anyone. Now she had a magic looking glass, a mirror, that she used to stand before and look in it and say,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?"
And the looking glass would answer,
"You are fairest of them all."
And she was contented, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. Now Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day, when the queen went to the mirror, she said,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?"
It answered,
"Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer than you."
This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy. And from that hour her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. Her envy and pride were like weeds growing up in her heart every day, until she had no peace, day or night. At last she sent for a huntsman and said,
"Take the child out into the wood so that I may see her no more. You must put her to death."
The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his sword to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to cry and said,
"Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood and never come home again."
Because she was so lovely, the huntsman had pity on her and said,
"Away with you then, poor child."
For he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared putting her to death. So the huntsman reported back to the queen that Snow White was dead. Now when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even of the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for her fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts after her, but they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a little house, where she went inside to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood a little table ready and covered with a white cloth, with 7 little plates, and 7 knives, and forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup a drop of wine so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that, she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another was too short, but finally the 7th was quite right, and she lay down upon it, committing herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house finally came home. They were 7 dwarfs, whose occupation was to dig underground in the mines among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in their little house, they saw that someone must have come in, as everything was not in the same order in which they left it. The first said,
"Who's been sitting in my chair?"
The second said,
"Who has been eating from my little plate?"
The third said,
Who has been taking my little loaf?
The fourth said,
Who has been tasting my porridge?
The fifth said,
Who has been using my little fork?
The sixth said,
Who's been cutting with my little knife?
The seventh said,
Who's been drinking from my little cup?
Then the first one, looking around, saw a hollow in his bed and cried.
"Who has been lying on my bed?"
And the others came running and cried too.
Oh, goodness gracious! What beautiful child is this?
Said they, and were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. And the seventh dwarf slept with his companions, an hour at a time with each, until the night had passed. When it was morning, and Snow White awoke and saw the seven dwarfs, she was very frightened. But they seemed quite friendly, and asked her what her name was, and she told them. And then they asked how she came to be in their house. So she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarves said,
"If you will keep our house for us, and cook,
And wash, and make the beds,
And sew and knit.
and keep everything tidy and clean.
you may stay with us, and you shall lack nothing."
With all my heart.
said Snow White. And so she stayed, and kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying,
"Beware of your stepmother."
She will soon know you are here, and let no one into the house.
Now the queen felt quite sure that now she was the first and fairest in the land, and she came to her mirror and said,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?
And the glass answered and said,
Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the seven little men is 1,000 times more fair.
Then she was very angry, for the mirror always spoke the truth. And she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought and thought how she could manage to put an end to her. For as long as she was not the fairest in the land, she would have nothing but envy. At last, she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. In this disguise, she went across the 7 mountains until she came to the little house of the 7 dwarfs. And she knocked on the door and cried out,
Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell.
Snow White peeped out of the window and said,
Good day, good woman. What have you to sell? Good wares, fine wares.
she answered,
Laces of all colors.
and she held a piece up that was woven of silk.
I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman.
Thought Snow White, so she unlocked the door and bought the pretty lace.
What a pretty girl you are, child.
Said the old woman.
Come and let me lace you properly for once.
Snow White did not suspect a thing, so she stood up before her and let her lace her up with this new lace. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down unconscious.
Now you have been done with being the fairest,
said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, and they were terrified to see their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the lace in two. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little she awakened. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said,
"The old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here."
And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her mirror and said,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?
But again it answered as before,
Queen, thou art of a beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair.
When she heard that, she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her face, for she knew that Snow White must still be living.
But now,
She said,
I will think of something that will be her ruin.
and by witchcraft she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up like another different sort of old woman. Then she traveled across the 7 mountains and came to the little house of the 7 dwarfs, and knocked on the door and cried,
Good wares to sell, good wares to sell.
Snow White looked out and said,
Go away. I must not let anybody in.
But you are not forbidden to look.
said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door. And when the bargain was made, the old woman said,
Now for once your hair shall be properly combed.
Poor Snow White, thinking there would be no harm, let the old woman do as she would. But no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work, and the poor girl fell down unconscious.
Now, you picture of beauty,
Said the wicked woman,
this is the end of you.
and she went off. By good luck, it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they thought that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, and found that poisoned comb. And no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself, and related all that had happened. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard, and never again let anyone in at that door. And the queen went home, and stood before the mirror as before, and said,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?
Again, the looking-glass answered as before,
Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair.
When she heard the looking-glass speak this way, she trembled and shook with anger.
Snow White shall die,
She cried out.
even if it should cost me my own life.
After this, she went to a secret, lonely chamber where no one was likely to come, and there she made a poisoned apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must want it. But whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and again went across the 7 mountains to where the little dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out of the window and said,
I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs told me not to.
All right.
answered the woman.
I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere. There, I will give you one.
No,
Answered Snow White,
I dare not take anything.
Are you afraid of poison?
said the woman.
Look here. I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You should have the red side. I will have the white one.
Now the apple was cleverly made, so that all the poison was in the red rosy part of it. Snow White longed for this beautiful apple, and as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer contain herself, but reached out her hand and took the poisoned half. No sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth. And the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and said,
As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again.
Then she went home and asked the looking-glass one more time,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?
This time it answered at last.
You are the fairest now.
Then her envious heart had peace at last, as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground. They lifted her up, sought to see if there was anything poisonous to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water, but all was to no avail. Then they laid her on a bed, and set all 7 of them round about it, crying and weeping for 3 whole days. Now for a long while Snow White lay on the bed, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep. For she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood, and came up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw the beautiful Snow White, and then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me kiss this fair maiden, and I will give you whatever you wish. If you consent, I will bring you to great honor, and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity on him, and permitted him to kiss the fair Snow White. As he did so, the kiss unlodged the poison bit of apple, which flew up out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, and said,
"Oh dear, where am I?"
The king's son answered full of joy, "You are near me." And relating all that had happened, he said, "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind, and went with him, and a wedding was held with great pomp and splendor. Now, unfortunately, Snow White's wicked stepmother was also invited, and when she had dressed herself up in beautiful clothes, she went to the looking-glass and said,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of us all?
This time, the looking-glass said,
O Queen, although you are of a beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair.
Then she railed and cursed and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First, she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she knew that she would have no peace until she went and saw this bride. At the wedding, when she saw Snow White, she became full of anger. She was so angry, in fact, she fell dead on the spot. But the prince and Snow White lived happily ever after. Oh yes, the 7 little men came to visit them very often, for they were their friends.